I'm Venetia Rainey, and this is Ukraine the Latest. Today, amid more drone strikes by Russia targeting Ukraine, we get the view from Tbilisi on last night's protests against Georgia's pro-Kremlin government. We also have a fascinating interview with Estonia's Foreign Minister Margus Tsahkna about Donald Trump and how he could be the Churchill of our times if he makes the right choices on Ukraine once he becomes president in January.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
The first duty of my government is security and defence, to make clear our unshakable support of NATO and with our allies towards Ukraine.
Kyiv stands strong.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Friday, 29th of November, 2 years and 285 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today I'm joined by our Associate Defence Editor Dom Nicholls in Paris, who'll be sharing some insights from a speech this morning by MI6 head Richard Moore. We're also very grateful to have Marika Mikiashvili joining us from Tbilisi, Georgia's capital. She was at last night's protest against the pro-Russian government's sudden decision to suspend talks on joining the European Union, so we'll be digging into the significance of that and what next for Georgia's opposition movement.
So, lots to get into, but let's start with some brief military and geopolitical updates. Starting with Russian strikes over the past 24 hours have killed at least one civilian in Kherson Oblast, and they've injured at least 22 around the country, according to regional authorities. Overnight, we had another massive drone attack. 132 drones launched at Ukraine overnight, according to Ukraine's Air Force. The drones injured at least 8 people in the capital Kyiv and in the southern Odessa region. Plus, some 13 residential buildings were struck in Odessa, and a children's medical facility was hit in the Dnipro district of Kyiv. Now, Ukraine's Air Force said it downed 88 of those 132 drones. Another 41 were lost, and one returned to Russian territory. As we've been covering on this podcast all week, we've seen a record number of drone attacks this week, striking apartment blocks and critical infrastructure. On Tuesday, Russia sent 188 drones into Ukraine. That's an all-time high, as we covered earlier this week. And then on Thursday, Moscow carried out a massive attack on Ukraine's power grid, causing blackouts across the country. Some parts of Ukraine are actually still without electricity. Analysts believe Russia is now capable of producing up to 100 attack drones a week and is fitting them with ever more destructive warheads. There's some quite interesting analysis in Australia's ABC about how Russia is using foam decoys, vacuum warheads and better navigation systems to help them build on these drone attacks, making them larger and more difficult to defend against. So we can expect to see lots more of that in the coming weeks and months. All of this comes as Russian President Vladimir Putin said that he would be using Oreshnik missiles to target decision-making centres in Kyiv. Oreshnik, as our listeners will remember, is what was used to target Dnipro last week. That was the one that was initially reported as an ICBM, but we now know it's actually a new-ish type of intermediate-range ballistic missile. Putin was speaking at the Collective Security Treaty Organization summit in Astana, Kazakhstan. That's the Russians' NATO equivalent. He said that the Russian military leadership is currently choosing targets to hit with Oreshnik missiles. I quote, "These could be military facilities, defence and industrial enterprises, or decision-making centres in Kyiv." He also said that this week's record attacks were a response to Ukraine's use of long-range US-made ATACMS. In his daily address last night, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky responded by accusing Putin of trying to escalate the war so that incoming US President Donald Trump wouldn't be able to end it, or at least would have to accept Russia's terms to do so. Now, meanwhile, on the ground, Russia is continuing its assault on Ukraine's east. It's launched more than 100 attacks in the key strategic hubs of Pokrovsk and Kharkov. Russia lost more than 2,000 troops in the past 24 hours. That's a record daily high, according to Ukraine's military. Obviously, we can't independently verify any of these figures, and battlefield losses are very difficult to estimate, but that would surpass the previous high of 1,950 Russian troops recorded by Ukraine earlier in November. And then just one final military update. Over in Russia, Ukraine's military struck the Atlas oil depot in the Rostov region overnight, causing a fire. The military said that Atlas was part of the Russian military-industrial complex that supplies petroleum products to the Russian army. And then one final bit of updates on the geopolitical side of things. The big story today really is Russia's growing ties with North Korea. Russia's Defence Minister Andrei Belousov arrived in Pyongyang this morning for talks with the country's military and political leaders. He was greeted by his North Korean counterpart, No Kwang-chol, and members of North Korea's military, according to the Russian Defence Ministry. And he apparently spent today in meetings with military and political leadership figures. He's since released a statement saying friendly ties between Russia and North Korea are actively expanding in all areas, including military cooperation. Obviously, these developments come amid deepening relations between the two countries. We know that North Korea is believed to have sent as many as 10,000 troops to the front lines in Kursk. The pariah country has also become Moscow's leading supplier of artillery shells and ballistic missiles. Sign of the significance of the relationship, we saw Putin making a very rare state visit to North Korea in June. And just one final point on this, there was quite an interesting article on the Daily NK yesterday detailing how North Korea is enforcing really strict secrecy around casualties among its troops fighting in Ukraine or Russia. A source within the Korean People's Army 11th Corps told the website that there are now internal protocols to quietly handle soldier deaths. These dictate that families should receive limited details and the public should be kept entirely in the dark. It's well worth a read. We'll link to that in the show notes of the podcast. And then meanwhile, one small development in Russia that I believe is worth marking. The courts there have sentenced the first person to be convicted for criticising the Ukraine war to another 3 years in jail. Alexei Gorinov is 63. He's already serving a 7-year sentence handed down in 2022 for wearing a paper badge with a peace sign drawn on it. This new sentence was on the charges of justifying terrorism, according to the Meduza Zona website. Now, let's bring in our guests, starting with Dom, who's in Paris at the moment. Dom, you've been at an MI6 briefing. What did you learn?
Well, hello, Venetia. Hello, everybody. Firstly, can you hear me okay, Venetia?
Yes, we can, Dom. I know you're in a noisy station in Gare du Nord, but we can hear you.
Right, thank you. Well, for anyone interested in a career in journalism, I wish I could paint the picture of the glamour right now as I'm crouched next to the bins in Gare du Nord station. So apologies for, you're just lucky it's not a scratch and sniff edition. But yes, also the glamour of a 3:30 a.m. alarm call to get the first Eurostar out here. But that's enough for all that. So Richard Moore, the head of Secret Intelligence Service, better known as MI6, is out here today at the British Embassy, the British Ambassador's residence. I'm giving a speech with his opposite number from the DGSE, the French External Security Service, Nicolas Lerner. So this was the first ever Entente Cordiale lecture. So we're told this is going to be an annual thing. We only really hear from the agency heads once a year for their public on-the-record speech. So I think we might get two now with this. Ambassador, you're spoiling us with this extra on-the-record speech from the head of MI6, this Entente Cordiale lecture. The reason I go on about that, it's 120 years since the Entente Cordiale. Britain and France decided we were all going to be best pals from here on out. In fact, they kept going on about that, and Richard Moore said it's no longer the Entente Cordiale, it should be the Entente Amicable, amicable. And they mentioned it a few times, got lots of ripples of applause and laughter and smiles all around. I think it's going to be the Entente Prendre une Chambre next time we're here, by the way they were going on. But the point I'm making is that it wasn't so much an annual speech, it was a lecture, and it was the first out of the blocks of these kind of things. So it's a lot of backslapping and mutual support, so a lot of historical examples. I mean, Francis would have loved it. We went back to Marshal Foch and the First World War and the Second World War and the Special Operations Executive and all this kind of stuff. So there weren't any massive news lines from it, I should say, straight up front, but it's interesting to speak to this chap. And then afterwards, we had an off-the-record question and answer session with him and Monsieur Lerner, his opposite number. And then we, the Brit journalists, just had a small huddle with Richard Moore separately, which is all off the record as well. So I can't say anything from there. So what can I say from his speech? Well, I'll say three things, really. Firstly, it was interesting what he didn't say. So he didn't say an awful lot about China. I will read you. There were a few references to it in the world stuff, but actually just specifically on China. All he said was, we must navigate the rise of an increasingly assertive China, which sometimes competes with our interests and whose values often do not align with our own. We play our part at MI6, keeping lines of communication open with our Chinese counterparts. So you might think that's pretty lukewarm, given some of the challenges we've had in the past with China. But of course, the context there is worth remembering is that we had the G20 meeting just a couple of weeks ago. Our Prime Minister Keir Starmer was there, and he was well, not going as far as to say a sort of reset in relations with China, but he was very keen to say, look, what did he say? We will compete where we should, challenge where we must, and confront where we, I don't know, what was it, where we feel like it or something. But anyway, it's all very diplomatic. So unsurprising that another major head of one of the big organs of state, the Secret Intelligence Service, is not going to be too hard on China in this speech today. But it was notable how lukewarm there wasn't really any criticism of China there. The second thing was the large orange elephant in the room, Donald Trump. So quite a few references to the British and American intelligence relationship, but touching on Five Eyes, not too much, because of course France isn't in the Five Eyes relationship. So they're not going to rub their noses in it, and they're not going to talk too much about it. But he had to say something about Trump. And again, not an awful lot, but what he said was, I worked successfully with the first Trump administration to advance our shared security and look forward to doing so again. That's it. He's not going to, as everyone else in the sort of British establishment has said so far, with Donald Trump and the administration about to start on the 20th of January, they will play the cards they're dealt. When we see what the new Trump administration looks like and the policy positions start to be announced, then they'll just deal with it. But Richard Moore was clear that for all the, as we remember, the sort of lively times of Trump 1, and we still had a very working relationship. And I think it's I'm not picking up from anyone anywhere in any official capacity that there'd be talk of withholding intelligence or information sharing with the Americans in a Trump 2. In that relationship, certainly in the Five Eyes, but particularly the British-American relationship, the US is by far the main provider of intelligence there. Yes, Britain is very good in certain areas, and we are net contributors in things like human intelligence, spying, MI6, all that kind of stuff. But generally, overall, when you look at signals intelligence and all the other facets that make up an intelligence capability, the Americans are the big beasts in the jungle there. So it would be an extraordinary move to even start suggesting that there be any sort of cooling of the intelligence relationship with the US just as Donald Trump's coming back. And then the third thing, of course, he majored on Russia and Putin and Ukraine. I mean, Monsieur Lerner, the head of the DGSC, he also was talking about this. He said he wanted to, quote, remind those who would doubt or would contest the binding links between our two countries. He said France and Great Britain have stood standing side by side in major crises shaking our planet. And he called out Ukraine, the Middle East, and said because of the values we share. So Richard Moore echoed that. He talked about a staggeringly reckless campaign of Russian sabotage in Europe. He's used those words before, or certainly the reckless campaign. Maybe staggering was a bit strong. In fact, I think it was his MI5 equivalent, Ken McCullum, who said it was a reckless campaign. But they're singing from the same hymn sheet here. He also then talked about, really rather interestingly, there was quite a lot of historical referencing. And Richard Moore went back to the Second World War, and he was talking about the Special Operations Executive that was working or raising resistance forces behind the lines, primarily against Nazi Germany, but also a little bit in the campaign in the Far East as well, but mainly in Europe. And he referred to the flame was kindled by the men and women of the Special Operations Executive. Famously, Richard Moore referenced this, famously given the sort of mission order by Churchill. Never mind your 20-page PowerPoint slides and all that kind of rubbish. SOE were just given the instructions, set Europe ablaze. Not a bad mission statement, set Europe ablaze. And then Richard Moore, he was referencing that, and he said within that framing of the Special Operations Executive, he said, that's MI6, he said, we cherish our heritage of covert action, which we keep alive today in helping Ukraine resist the Russian invasion. So, of course, my ears prick up and go, ooh, give us some detail about this covert action. And no, we're straight on to something else after that. There's absolutely no detail whatsoever. So it was a very wave-toppy thing. But it did make a few other points. He talked about a thing that Putin goes on a lot about. They like meddling in democracy, and Putin likes to point out that, he tries to portray democracy as a sort of chaotic organisation. And, okay, maybe the Brits covered ourselves in glory with having 15 prime ministers in a couple of weeks, or whatever the maths are at the moment. But Richard Moore said, Russia should avoid the classic error of the authoritarian state, which confuses the splendidly irreverent clash and thunder of democracy with weakness and irresolution. Our democracy is our strength. continuously bestowing legitimacy on our leaders' decisions. I quite like that phrase, that splendidly irreverent clash and thunder of democracy, which does paint it in a nutshell. That is what democracy is. It's messy. As Churchill said, democracy is the worst form of government apart from all the others. What else did he say? He was talking about how he works arm in arm with DGSE and lots of stuff about, well, here we go. Putin is jeopardizing Russia's future, pouring vast sums into his military machine and squandering tens of thousands of lives, Russian and now North Korean, in his catastrophic conflict. He said Putin has put Russia in hock to Tehran, Beijing and Pyongyang. I do not doubt the transactional consequence of that arrangement and the succor it brings to Russia, but it is a transaction. There is no real trust or respect. Its roots are shallow. There are limits to the partnership. So we've heard similar before. As I said, I'm not expecting any major news lines out of something like this first lecture. And to be honest, the annual speech that the chiefs all give, the important bit is that they are on the record for once, so we can actually use the talismanic 3 letters of MI6. And I long ago gave up with the sub-editors trying to say SIS, and then I'd always have to go MI6. So I just now say MI6, but to give it its correct title. But it was all fine. They treated us to some nice pastries in the ambassador's house, some nice coffee. I wasn't allowed in. I got here because I'm a good little boy. Got the first train out of London this morning and had a nice stroll through Paris down to the ambassador's residence. I thought rather than get a cab, I had a long time, so I thought I'd stroll down there. Very, very pleasant walk. I was only propositioned by a very polite young lady once and nearly mugged twice. So yeah, I mean, it was nice to be back in Paris, quite frankly. Got to the ambassador's residence half an hour early and wasn't allowed in. I was dispatched round the corner to a little cafe where I had a very nice coffee and a pan of chocolate, which I think was freshly baked at some point in the last 2 weeks. It certainly wasn't this morning. But no, that's me now. I've checked in from the Eurostar on the way back. I've yet to start typing anything for the news desk Venetia, but if they ask, you can tell them I'm furiously bashing the keyboard. I'm going to head over to that nice little bar over there, I think, and get a little Stella to get the mental juices flowing. And I'm going to move away from this bin because it's really starting to smell. I don't know what that is down there. Is that an apple?
Okay. Before you do any bin diving or head out for your Stella, can I just ask one follow-up question? What do you think was the purpose of this speech? What was the sort of main message that Richard Moore was trying to get across? And just a sort of quick correction that you were right, it was Richard Moore who said that Russia was conducting a staggeringly reckless campaign of sabotage. I'm just wondering, is he trying to rally his European allies ahead of quite a difficult potential year next year? What do you think he was trying to do?
Well, I mean, I think the primary audience for this was Putin. He's trying to show that we're absolutely arm in arm. I think he used that phrase. I think that's a quote, arm in arm with the DGSE. He's making the point yet again that the Allied support for Ukraine is resolute and not going anywhere. I mean, I think the backdrop here, as we've reported on the podcast, about the Russian economy is in real trouble at the moment. Things really are starting to bite there. So, Putin's not going to be happy. Russia is prevailing at the moment on the battlefield. There's no two ways of saying that. We've reported it every day, but it's coming at extreme cost, and the lines are barely shifting. The lines on the ground are barely shifting. So whilst Putin may be winning, it's not to suggest that he is close to winning the war. So I think this is just another message today from a major British official to say that the resolve of those opposed to Putin in the international community and those resolved to supporting Ukraine is absolutely rock solid. And this comes on the back of the messages we heard at the G20 and elsewhere. And of course, there's going to be some positioning, of course, ahead of Donald Trump's inauguration next month or in January. There's no two ways. That is the international context at the moment, of course. But yeah, put it the other way, if he hadn't made this speech / lecture, would Putin have thought, the international opposition to me is crumbling? Yeah, probably not. But it doesn't hurt. I mean, it's so rare to get these guys on the record. So Ken McCallum, the head of MI5, and Keith Butler, the head of GCHQ, they make one public speech a year, and that's it. So it's very, very rare to actually get them on the record. So whilst I said there's no news line, the fact that they are doing this, and again, the Entente Cordiale is not going to come as a shock to anyone. It's been around for 120 years. But these things don't happen by accident. There's a lot of diplomatic activity that goes in the background of making these things happen. And that won't go unnoticed by Putin and the Russian machine.
Great. Thank you so much, Dom. We'll let you crack on with the rest of your reporting. Thanks for tuning in from Paris.
Thank you. See you next week.
I'm going to bring in our other guest now, who's been waiting patiently in Tbilisi. Marika Mikiashvili, and I hope I've pronounced that correctly, is a Georgian researcher and political activist. She is the Coalition for Change Alliance representative from the Droa party and also its foreign secretary. She's also a university lecturer. Now, quick backgrounder on why we're talking about Georgia today on this podcast. Last night, there were violent clashes after Georgia's special forces violently dispersed a protest in central Tbilisi over the ruling Georgian Dreams party decision to suspend talks on joining the European Union until 2028. That announcement came just a few hours after the European Parliament adopted a non-binding resolution which rejected the results of last month's parliamentary elections. We've covered that on this podcast. We know that controversially handed victory to the Georgian Dream Party. The resolution said that there were significant irregularities and called for new elections within a year and also for sanctions to be imposed on the Georgian Dream Prime Minister and some other top party officials. Georgian Dream, as our listeners will know very well, is considered by its critics to be pro-Russian and also trying to steer the country away from Europe and towards Moscow. That's despite the fact that opinion polls show about 80% of Georgians support EU membership, an ambition that's also reflected in the country's constitution. So, Marika, let me bring you in finally. You were there at the protests last night. What happened? What did you see?
Hello, Venetia. I'm very pleased to have the opportunity to speak on the Ukraine, the latest, and thank you very much. Yes, so yesterday when the decision of the government, or to be more correct, of one person, this Russian-made oligarch, Bidzina Ioanishvili, who is the main guy behind everything, and the government is simply his puppets, that's it. Now all of them are illegitimate and unconstitutional too. So they made the decision to halt Georgia's EU accession process, supposedly until 2028. But this essentially means forever, because of course they're not going to say in 2028 that, oh yeah, okay, so let's proceed with European integration now, because European integration is inherently against their grip on power. They cannot allow these reforms of judiciary, of electoral system to go through, because otherwise they would be simply losing the power. So they are now arguing on a technicality that they are not suspending European integration, but it is just a matter of time, because until there is war in Ukraine, EU makes the accession talks as a blackmail to drag Georgia into war with Russia as a second front to Ukraine. So I was there at night. The atmosphere was extremely tense. People were extremely angry. I do not remember such tense atmosphere, maybe only in May, if you were having a look at this Russian law or foreign agents law protests, only a couple of days maybe in May. But even the Georgian Dream selected public defender, who usually justifies Georgian Dream actions, said yesterday that the demonstration was peaceful and that the force used against them was excessive and unjustified. So everyone could see it coming, because the buildup of the security forces was happening for hours and the people were extremely tense too, extremely angry. However, everyone agrees that this time they were extremely violent. So they would, like, when they'd see a journalist, they'd just strike him down just because they're journalists. They wouldn't allow anyone to film arrests. They wouldn't allow people to film arrests with their phones or cameras of the televisions. They physically attacked girls and women, and some people have their noses broken. And they also just caught people and sprayed the pepper spray in their eyes, like as a person-to-person contact, these special forces and so on. And well, I'm not even talking about beating and dragging people on the ground and 10 policemen beating one person. What is also very noteworthy is that they have some very powerful water cannon machines. By the way, the government boasted even before elections that they had already purchased new water cannon machines, and we should have known it was a hint. In hindsight, it was a hint that the elections would be stolen. So it has the water flow that goes a very long distance. But they mix this water with pepper spray, and this is disastrous because water and pepper spray are very painful combination together. You cannot wash down spray with the water. It is against recommendations. So they are making everything as toxic and as violent as possible. In the morning, when there were only a very few protesters left, and they were already like brutally dispersed, the last wave of assault, and only 2 or 3 people were sheltering in a pharmacy, they actually went after them into a pharmacy and assaulted them inside the pharmacy. And my friend was there. She was one of them inside the shop. And she said that if not for a media camera that was nearby and who managed to take a footage of what was happening inside from outside, then they probably would have killed them with beat.
Thanks, Marika. I'm interested that thousands of people turned out last night. I know earlier this week there was a protest against last month's election, but it was quite muted, right? Not many people turned out. Why did so few people turn out to that protest?
Yes, that is a very good question, actually. So I think it's a psychological thing, psychological special operation of Russia together with electoral special operation, of course. Well, I do not know whether in spring, when they tabled this foreign agents law that we call the Russian law, they actually inherently thought to tire us out, or whether they simply went along with the public outburst of protest and rage and simply let us go by back in spring in hope that we, in anticipation for the elections, would just go home with the feeling that, yes, we can win these elections. And once they would steal elections, then they would force us into despair and depression. And because that is what the oligarch behind everything, Bidzina Ivanishvili, actually said in April, that he would just tire us out for autumn. And essentially, that is what happened. Now, I don't know if that was their plan A or they went along with it as a plan B once the protests were really big. But eventually, their plan by the election time was, yes, the fact that it would be such a shock for people to have the election stolen that it will require some time until people process the shock and mobilize and gain energy for another round. Because after the elections were stolen, people finally fully realized that there is no getting rid of them with elections. And the realization of that means a lot. It needs a big psychological preparation on an individual and a collective level to get rid of a government without elections, basically, right? So I think that is what the Georgian society was processing in the month after the elections. But it is important that there were still some, and in some ways, quite successful tactical episodes of resistance still. And now this rejection of the EU bid comes off as the, as the trigger. Because maybe the numbers were not that high protesting in November, but the stealing of elections was a bomb. And the next topic that would come in would serve as the trigger to the already existing bomb of frustration over having had this election stolen. So I think that is what is happening now.
I'm interested to hear what you make of the Ukrainian foreign minister's comments this morning. Dmitry Kuleba said that the situation in Georgia, he thinks, is a mirror image of what Ukraine was going through in November 2013. At the time, President Viktor Yanukovych had announced he wouldn't sign the EU association agreement, and it sparked nationwide protests. And of course, we all know what's happened since. I'm wondering if you agree with that assessment.
Overall, in the big geopolitical picture, yes, I agree with it, definitely. However, on a local level, there are differences. There are some things that put Georgia in an even more disadvantaged position than Ukrainians in 2013. But there are some things that are potentially aiding Georgians more than Ukrainians in 2013. For example, I think the Kremlin has learned a lot. And also because of the specificity of Georgian society, that everyone is so overwhelmingly pro-Western, which in 2013 was not that much of a case in Ukraine. It was more split than the Georgian society is. This government had to be a Trojan horse. I wish they had been more clear about their intentions, but it was their mask and also illusion of security that we had in our society, that Georgia can never be dragged back into the Russian orbit because we are so pro-Western, that made them even more covert and even more dangerous. And Yanukovych did not have as much power in Ukraine as these guys have here, because there were other oligarchs in Ukraine. He didn't have one-party majority and totalitarian grip over the state and the material resources. In Georgia, that is the case. One man has everything, from material resources to every single official in the country, from some village head to the government and everything. So Georgia is much more monolithic in every sense, which is a disaster right now. However, and the government is much more, in some ways, smart and covert. And by the way, before yesterday's crackdown, the entire month that we had this election fraud protest, the police was also being very smart. They were not assaulting, they were trying to simply exhaust us. And I was nervous how smart they were being. And that is also what they learned from Ukraine. They learned from Ukraine not to make hasty steps. However, I don't know, maybe eventually with yesterday's decision to halt the US session, they're still being dumb in their smartness as well. Let's see. Hopefully that's the case. However, on the plus side for Georgians is that, I don't know, maybe Yanukovych assumed that he could crush half of the country with bullets because he had the other half. That's what he thought. And that's what emboldened him to deploy snipers and so on. In Georgia, never say never, because now we're going through things we didn't think we would be going through necessarily, although it was plausible. Violence does send shockwaves. So I do not think they have mandate in any sense to shoot people. They are even shying away from shooting rubber bullets. They are going excessive on everything else, but whatever is associated with the blood, they try not to fully piss off whoever they still have supporters. So there can be some restrictions on excess of force, which might not have been there in Ukraine, and hopefully this is the case, hopefully.
And then just one final question before we wrap up. What next for Georgia's opposition movement? I mean, do you still feel hopeful?
Yes, certainly. Well, success is not guaranteed, of course, but this is essentially war. This is a national liberation struggle. I think we do have more than sufficient grounds for optimism, given that we do have the president, even if for a month still. We do have opposition. Yes, of course, it's not like one monolithic organization, but the opposition is still united. And from yesterday on, even more, the president outright said, I'm only with you if you are fully united and coordinated. So that's it. And the public at large is also against the government. Well, the army will, I do not think the army will include themselves in any way, but at least they cannot deploy them against us because the army does not support them. At least we are an EU candidate country. I suppose it comes with some things, like, for example, the Western assessment has to be harsh. So with internal non-cooperation with the regime, with external non-recognition of the elections, not shaking hands with GD, and with protests, it is still possible that the regime cracks. And now is the brief opportunity, as I said, to force them into fully unmasking, and they have done so basically until they can afford it. Now they will want to double down extremely, probably, in the nearest days and weeks to scare us, but it is possible that this is their last fume. They will double down extremely, because if we do not get scared of this until it gets better, it gets worse episode, then they know that they might start cracking. Hopefully that is the case, and I'm sure that the people will not give up. And hopefully we are right in assessment that they're not still in the position to withstand full public confrontation.
Coming up, an interview with Estonia's foreign minister about Donald Trump. Don't go away. Welcome back. Now, earlier this week, our Associate Defence Editor, Dom Nicholls, interviewed Estonia's Foreign Minister, Margus Tsahkna, about how Donald Trump could change the conflict in Ukraine. Here's their conversation.
Well, Mr. Tsahkna, Minister of Foreign Affairs in Estonia, thank you so much for spending some time with Ukraine, the latest today. If I could start, please, on the subject of Ukraine. I got back last night with a team here from a few days in Kyiv and Kharkiv. I note today that Russian Foreign Intelligence Service Director Sergei Narishkin, he was speaking yesterday. He said that Russia is open to negotiations, but that Russia categorically rejects any freezing of the current front line or the creation of a demilitarized zone. What's your response to his words?
Let me translate. They say directly that they are not interested about any kind of just and long-lasting peace negotiations. So it has been already like this 2.5 years. And it will continue, and we need to understand that this kind of, the willingness to find and start any kind of negotiations or talks, it needs that Putin will change the course, will change the goal. But he has not changed it at all. He's pushing more heavily than ever before, and this kind of different calls or different opportunities to find that let's start to talking. He's in a strong position now, and this is a weak position, and we cannot allow it to happen. So we need to focus on how can we support Ukraine to fight back, and daily base in the meaning. They're fighting heavily, and situation is really not very optimistic in the meaning. But they are fighting, and they have a will for that, and our duty is to support.
Now, after the Budapest Memorandum and the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements, do you think this current Russian leadership can ever be trusted to negotiate anything in good faith?
With Russia and with Putin is the rule that you can negotiate from the strong position. And also, if you're making any compromises, it will be the new red line for them, and they're pushing heavily. So we have experienced that in 1994, when we negotiated the Russian troops out from Estonia. Even we gained our independence in 1991, the troops were here. And thanks for our allies and US strong positions as well, and of course the leadership was different at the time in Russia, we were happy that the troops actually withdrew when they went out from Estonia, and we became the named member of NATO and EU. Though we need to have a strong position, and I do hope as well that Trump will understand that he hasn't this great opportunity to be a strong leader. And I've even wrote some articles about I compared the situation with 1938 before the Munich meeting when Chamberlain went back and said that now the peace will come. It was a weak position about the white paper, but up to this time we need to just support Ukraine. They need to fight back, and we have enough resources for that. And also I'm happy that President Biden has taken down, and all the others as well, the restrictions of using the long-range missiles. We already see that. Of course, it makes Putin more nervous, and he's playing with our fears about escalation, but there is nothing new. I don't believe that Putin will use any kind of nuclear attack, because then militarily this is nonsense, but also politically he's going to cross all the red lines, I think, as well, with these countries who are like supporting him. Though we need to focus and support Ukraine to fight, and we need to invest more to our defense.
Now, you talk about European allies there, and you mentioned Donald Trump. I'll come on to him a bit later if I may. But in terms of European allies, it is very early days in any talk of negotiations and ceasefire and what have you. And I agree. I think we're quite a long way away from that. But in the emerging debate, do you notice any consensus among European allies regarding any ceasefire, or do you think there are already some dissenting voices? And at what point does having good, honest, open discussions and ideas become dissenting voices?
Happily, I don't see this kind of like initiatives to ask the ceasefire and start negotiations. We have, the The Chancellor Scholz's phone call, I think that it was tactical mistake, but actually what the Chancellor said to Putin was exactly the position that the European Union and the European countries have. Though, it's a good thing that we are united in the position, but also I think that the reason is, of course, to support Ukraine, but the reason is that the most European countries and nations finally understands that Russia is a threat to us as well. So it's not only the problem of Ukraine, it's a problem for us as well in a perspective. And also I think that Putin has made a mistake in the meaning of bringing the North Korean troops in. And also the red flags, they have risen as well in US because of that, because North Korea has been like the enemy or the most not liked country in the world already decades for US politicians, both parties. And the second thing about that is that Putin, because of bringing the North Korean troops to Europe, very close to NATO borders, changed the understanding as well about this aggression. It is not only anymore aggression against Ukraine from Russia, but it's already global. It's not only as well the North Korean troops there, but this is a fact that actually all this kind of like evil part of the world is now in this conflict, and it will change, I think, the position. And maybe this is a sign as well that Putin is running out of resources, in the meaning that he's dependent on North Korea already, not only about troops, but also maybe like economically and, the ammunition and many other aspects. Though the situation is more complicated, but I see as well that there are many opportunities to keep going and to find finally a long-lasting peace. And we can have this strong position all together.
Now, you talk about an evil part of the world, and if I may, would that include Russia, Iran, North Korea, possibly the more belligerent side of Chinese behaviour? I mean, evil is a strong word. I don't want to lump China in there immediately. But when it comes to supporting Russia in this war and tacit agreement for North Korea, I think if we sort of put those together, do you think then that there is an opportunity here for Donald Trump, for example, to take a much greater interest? He's sort of cool on the idea of Ukraine. But now that these threats are so much closer than they were in his first term in office, do you think he could see himself as the global Superman? He could break this, as you say, the evil part of the world. Do you think this will draw him in closer, or he will still see these as different threats?
Let's see how he sees this, what will be the plan. Our Prime Minister had a call yesterday with President Trump elected, also many other leaders, and the information what we have is that actually Trump is listening carefully about proposals, about arguments, why we are in such a position to support Ukraine, what is our views. But I'm totally agreeing that Trump is in a strong position. First, he has a very strong mandate from elections. Also, he has the Senate and Congress at the moment in the meaning of the majority control. And the second thing, I think that the parallel can be done with Chamberlain and Churchill story. Of course, times are different, but we have the time 1938 before the Munich. And the situation is different in the meaning of U.S. position globally. U.S. is stronger than they were at this time. The conflict is more global, as it was at the moment in 1938. And Trump have an opportunity as well to become the Churchill of our times, in a meaning. And that the broad fact is that the world is more divided than ever before between non-democratic countries and dictatorships and democracies. And this fight now, which Ukraine has, it's not only about their own territory and freedom, of course, but it's about as well our rule of law and way of living. And that's why I'm totally agreeing with you that Trump has this opportunity to have a strong position, and our experience as well has been from the past when Trump was first time president, that he likes to have a strong position to negotiate. And all these opportunities are there.
And of course, during his first tenure, we saw NATO spending, all the individual member countries' spending on defence go up, which almost certainly wouldn't have happened had Donald Trump not been the president. So do you think him coming back, he's the right man at the right time for this problem?
It's not me to say right man, but he's president elected. He has a full mandate from the democratical country as US is. Though we are fulfilling our plans we made already years ago. We invest heavily more to our defense. Estonia is doing 3.4% of GDP, and on top of that, we have a special program for the next 4 years to invest heavily to our long-range and deep strike capabilities to fulfill actually the NATO regional defense plans, which we adopted last year in Vilnius. Though we work with presidents who are there in office, and we have a very solid arguments about our support to Ukraine and regional security and also the membership of NATO to Ukraine, because we do believe that the only working security guarantee is NATO, actually, in our region. Because the neutralities or the so-called gray zones in the neighboring countries of Russia, it's just a green light for Putin. It has been Georgia 2008, it started as well with Ukraine 2014 already. And any kind of agreements, as we had this Minsk I and Minsk II, it was just the break to prepare for Putin the next level aggression. So we need to change the goal of Putin. It's not only a question about supporting Ukraine, but it's a question about our own security. These arguments are there, and I think that we have enough resources actually to do it.
Yes, and talking about resources, I still have my copy of Ukraine's discussion paper setting transatlantic defence up for success, a military strategy for Ukraine's victory and Russia's defeat. I thought it was a very good piece of work. And one of the things it highlighted, it said that if NATO countries committed 0.25% of GDP towards Ukraine annually, that would raise 120 billion euro. And it was described as very affordable, and that would go a long way. Certainly if that was committed to for over sort of 4 years, so you can plan on it and you can build factories and facilities and infrastructure, then that would go a long way to help Ukraine succeed. Why did this paper get such a lukewarm response? I've not heard it referred to anywhere else. Only when I talk with Estonian officials does this come up, or that idea of the 0.25% be understood or remembered, acknowledged. Why the lukewarm response to your paper?
Actually, I don't agree with you, because our paper, our plan, and however we call it, it gained a lot of interest, and actually many countries followed that as well. And it was under this discussion amongst the NATO members as well.
How many have signed up to the 0.25%?
I think that pretty many countries. I know that all the Baltics and Finland and I think Sweden, Denmark, but I don't have a list of that. So we have signed a bilateral agreement with Ukraine for the next 4 years about 0.25% of GDP annually, military support. And many others, they did the same. So, but you're right, if all we do the same things, there won't be a problem with resources. But yes, unfortunately, not all have done it. But I do hope that it will come. Because just to have this philosophical thought that we would have given all with what we have gave already to Ukraine within the first year of the war. So the war was already finished with the victory of Ukraine, and Russia would have been pushed back to Russia. So the longer this aggression is going, the more expensive it will be for us as well. Of course, for Ukrainians who are losing their best sons and territories, but also we need to understand that the most efficient and also the cheapest way to finish this aggression is actually to invest to support Ukraine.
I mean, it does seem to be the case that the further north and the further east you go through Europe, the NATO members are much more clear-eyed about the threat and much more prepared to stump up the political support and the money. In your answer there, I note the UK, France, Germany, Italy have not signed up to 0.25% of GDP. And you've recently hosted Gabriels Landsbergis, Lithuania's foreign minister. I think that was yesterday. But he thanked you for what he said was another chance to strengthen our bonds and our region's security. We agree on the importance of stepping up preparedness to deal with hybrid attacks and of sticking together in these turbulent times. He was responding to your comments that when Estonia and Lithuania talk, you say, we don't need a long warm-up because we speak with one voice on supporting Ukraine and how to stop Russia from threatening Europe's security. So you may speak with one voice, but who is listening if the UK, France, Germany, Italy, the broadest shoulders are not prepared to step up to some of these arguments?
We are not tiring of speaking and talking about that, but also we are executing. So Estonia has given to Ukraine approximately like 3.4% of GDP support. And per capita, I think we are the leader in the world. And we are not proud of that in the meaning that, yes, we are first, but everyone should do it. I cannot decide other governments' decisions. I'm the foreign minister of Estonia. But it is obvious that if you're the neighboring country of Russia, if you have a history and your people, all our families, we are remembering how does it look like if you have no freedom, if you're losing 1/5 of our population with deportations and killings and as refugees. Though exactly the same things are happening in Ukraine, we are solidar with them, but at the same time we understand as well that it may come to Europe as well. We need to be prepared. So for us, this is existential question. But also, I think that UK people should understand that UK troops are here. They are a frame country for the NATO Enhanced Foreign Present mission here, and they are ready to go within a first second to fight together with our troops. Of course, US troops we have here in many other countries as well. Though we are not standing and talking only about us and Ukraine, but we are talking about Europe, we are talking about NATO, we are talking about European Union. Though we need to keep going to explain that. But I see as well the big change if you compare the situation like 3 years ago in Europe. I think that not nobody, but too many countries, they didn't take this threat from Russia like seriously. I think that there is no country now in Europe who is not taking it seriously. The question is how far you are from the border, and then what is your position in the meaning of collecting defense and sharing the burden. So this is another argument. But I want to add as well, GDP is an honest figure. I've been told many times that as well that, okay, you can put like 3.4% of GDP or 5% because you're a small country, you need to do it. But GDP is an honest figure and it is exactly described the burden or the weight, what is in our society's shoulders. So this is an equal thing, and I do hope that this understanding is coming more and quicker to all nations in Europe at least, then it will be too late.
Very diplomatic language there. I do like the diplomatic language you use. I'll talk about the ICC in a moment, if I may. But just looking at Europe and the defence needed here, former Lithuanian Prime Minister and now Commissioner Designate for Defence and Space in the European Parliament, Andrius Kubilius, is working with the EU's High Representative for Foreign Affairs, Kaja Kallas, your former Prime Minister. They're preparing a paper on European defence. Now, before looking at what you suggest any conclusions might be from that paper, what questions do you think it should be answering?
The first thing is that we need to understand that NATO is the organization which is guaranteeing militarily European security. And we have been always in the position that there is no effective way to create parallel systems, because we have been investing to NATO, we have plans, we have exercises, we have all the system, Article 5, 4 ready to go. But what Europe must do is to invest heavily more to defense industry, to invest heavily more to capabilities. And what I do hope from this paper and also with political decisions is to share the burden. You know, we have been talking about the defense bonds of Europe, because even if Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania is putting, and also Poland is putting like 4, 5, 6%, it's not good enough for Europe. And also, I do hope that the relations with UK and European Union are going to be more close, because UK has a great role here as well to invest more and to take the leadership position about that and to cooperate. Though I think that the main question is about funding, to find the money, to invest heavily more all together as European Union, to find a cooperation with US and also UK, of course, and as well to sign actually the agreements or contracts with the defense industry for a long term, because defense industry is not following. We can make political decisions, but we need to have money, and also we have to have a long-term agreements, what kind of defense capabilities we need. So this is all together, and I hope that this new European Union Commission has a mandate as well to act, because I think that the European Parliament elections, if you see the structure there, political positions, so the Parliament position is to support it.
I've been looking at the terms for the paper, and you talk about cooperation with the US and defence sovereignty. The white paper is expected to predominantly address defence sector capability, industrial competitiveness, investment, and so on. But how does Europe keep the US close? Should Europe be buying more US kit, in which case the European defence industrial base may suffer, or, as Donald Trump has hinted, should Europe take on more responsibility for its own security and build up its own defence industrial base by possibly cutting out some of the big US firms, which might drive the US away? Where do you see the balance between those two tensions?
In my experience, as well as a former defense minister, is that there won't be in real life the situation that you're doing one or the other. This is all mixed in a meaning. There are some systems and the only production capabilities are in US. As well politically, it would be great if we are connected in a meaning economically. And we are more connected with US economically than ever before, not only about the defense industry. I think that European countries are maybe the biggest partner in the meaning of creating jobs in US as well. So we are very much connected. This transatlantic bond is not only about defense and security, it's economical cooperation as well. But if we add money, the European taxpayers' money, so of course it must go as well to our defense industries, our economies as well. But this practical cooperation about defense industry and also the political cooperation is crucial as well. So it will be a mix anyways.
I agree. It will be a mix, but in something like the F-35 program that's now getting so big, attack aviation, Poland's going to be the biggest non-US user of Apache. I think they're going to get 89 airframes. I mean, it comes a point where these programs are so big that you either have to be a part of it, or you just don't have access to all the data connections. So I do accept that it's all a balance, but Lockheed Martin are not going to be happy if you decide to go elsewhere for some systems and try and say, well, it's all going to be a balance. I mean, they do have a habit of getting their own way, don't they?
You know, I'm a more practical person because the case is not how to pump up the defense industry of Europe. The case is how to get as quick as possible the real capabilities. And this is exactly what Estonia is doing. We are buying them from US, from Europe, from South Korea. Though we need really these capabilities not as a huge project for 30 years in the future. We need them now. So that must be a goal. If we have money, then how can we work together with the European defense industry? Also, I see in European Union inside as well that there are different interests, and protectionism is coming more and more to invest only for your own defense industry. So we need to understand that this problem, what we are preparing, it's a real problem. So we need to prepare for that. It's not just like the case, as sometimes we say about the common agricultural policy in Europe, that finally it's like living its own life. We put more than 60% of our European Union budget to different kind of benefits. And finally we forgot actually what was the common policy of that. So the main goal is to create these capabilities as quick as possible, to have money and instruments for that, and also to have agreements and deals, and also transatlantic bond is very practical as well and political about this cooperation.
If I could just head a little south of where you are now, I believe. I'm guessing you're in Tallinn.
I'm in Tallinn, yeah.
You're in Tallinn. So if we can go, last week Latvia hosted the 12th meeting regarding the establishment of a special tribunal for the crime of aggression against Ukraine. 39 countries were represented. And at the end of that meeting, members signed the Vienna-Riga statement, which reaffirms their commitment to working towards establishing such a tribunal. Why has it taken 12 meetings to get this far?
Actually, what we are talking about accountability. And we are talking about aggression crimes. And aggression crimes are leadership crimes. And we finished the only war we finished in the proper ways about accountability was actually the Second World War, and we had this Nuremberg Special Tribunal. Unfortunately, we have no consensus about that to form it again about Putin and all the others. So we are trying to convince our partners more widely that it must be useful, because if our listeners don't know that the leaders, they have immunity about the aggression crimes right now. And how can we explain that. So it takes time, there is no breakthrough, and I think that situation is even more complicated because we are more divided than maybe even like 2 years ago in United Nations. We may have an opportunity to use the Council of Europe for that, to move forward. But the situation is complicated about accountability. I'm agreeing with that.
So just finally then, a lot of our listeners are very concerned. They get in touch with us every day. They are very nervous about the threat of nuclear war. They see what's happening, and we say don't allow Putin to own the narrative here. He wants us to be scared. But these are very big issues and will have enormous consequences. What do you say to people listening to this podcast who are very worried about the possibility of an outbreak of nuclear war?
I'm saying very clearly our position is that we don't believe that Putin will use a nuclear weapon. Putin is using our fears. Putin is using the threat of escalation, and very successfully, unfortunately. Though he has been telling already, 2.5 years that he will escalate if we're giving tanks and long-range missiles and so on and so on. And he needs to play with that. But actually we must be sure and we must be clear as well that we need to have very strong position and no fear. So militarily, this is nonsense for Putin to use nuclear weapon. And politically, he will lose even these supporters who are supporting him now. Because then these red lines are crossed totally, and I think that Putin is pragmatical. But till we are letting him to play with our fears, so he's using this position. So what I'm telling our listeners now that don't be afraid in the meaning, and we just need to act. If we are in weak position and Putin would like to do whatever, though we let him to do, but we need to be in a strong position.
Mr. Tsahkna, Minister of Foreign Affairs for the country of Estonia, thank you so much for talking to Ukraine the Latest.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Nicholls. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get your first 3 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Or sign up to Dispatches, our foreign affairs newsletter, bringing stories from our award-winning foreign correspondents straight to your inbox. We also have a Ukraine live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph on X, formerly known as Twitter, so that you don't miss it. To our listeners on YouTube, please note that due to issues beyond our control, there is sometimes a delay between broadcast and upload, so if you want to hear Ukraine the Latest as soon as it's released, do refer to podcast apps. If you appreciated this podcast, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app, and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware that we exist. You can get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk, and we do continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You can find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Executive producers are Louisa Wells and David Nicholls.